Clarence Thomas thought he was in control until 46 seconds later, Traoré held up a document that hadn't seen daylight in 30 years. What could be so dangerous that even the Supreme Court tried to bury it? The chambers of justice. Clarence Thomas were cloaked in quiet, the kind of stillness that doesn't invite peace, but rather reminds you of the weight of the decisions made inside. Outside, Washington, D.C. buzzed with summer heat and a gathering storm of voices. But inside these marble halls, the tick of an antique clock and the soft hum of air conditioning were the only reminders of time passing. Clarence Thomas sat behind an oak desk so massive it could have been mistaken for an altar. To some, perhaps it was. The blinds were drawn halfway, slanting bars of light across the room like prison bars laid gently across ancient law books. His fingers traced the edge of a thick case folder without really reading it. His eyes, tired, heavy-lidded, were fixed on a framed photograph in the far corner of the room. Not a family photo, not his Yale graduation, but an old newspaper clipping. First Black conservative confirmed to Supreme Court, 1981. That yellowed headline stared back at him like an accusation. He once believed that history would see him as a man who stood apart, independent, constitutional, free from the tug of public opinion or partisan trend. He had written it into every dissenting opinion like gospel. But something had changed, not in the law, in the air. He could feel it now, like smoke seeping under a door before you see the flames. Protests not yet at the steps of the court, but on every screen, every podcast, every street mural in D.C. Whispers of corruption, questions about gifts, friendships, and forgotten disclosures. His name had begun to appear not in law journals but in hashtags. The worst part, it wasn't just critics. It was former students, clerks, even Black scholars who once saw him as a symbol of ascension. They had started to turn, some quietly, some with fire. He reached for a cup of tea on a coaster, took a long sip, then glanced at the flat-screen monitor on the wall. The headline blazed across it like a slap. African leader slams U.S. Supreme Court for hypocrisy at UN. He squinted. The image of the speaker was still loading. A man in military fatigues standing tall at a podium adorned with the United Nations emblem. His name, Ibrahim Traoré. Clarence frowned. Another populist from the global south, he muttered. He reached for the remote and increased the volume. And how can any court, especially in a land that once claimed moral authority, decide who deserves dignity when their own judges dine with billionaires while stripping rights from the poor? Traoré's voice was sharp, clear, accented, but precise. We will not take lectures from those who have forgotten justice in pursuit of legacy. Thomas stiffened. The room suddenly felt smaller. The quiet had changed, less peaceful, more judgmental. It was as if the chamber walls lined with legal tomes and constitutional scrolls were holding their breath. Who was this man? He tapped on his keyboard and pulled up more information. President of Burkina Faso. Age 36, former artillery officer, rose to power in a civilian uprising. No formal elections. A revolutionary, Thomas snorted. Another African strongman with a microphone. Yet even as he said it, there was something about the way Traoré spoke. Not just defiant, purposeful, with the weight of a million unseen witnesses behind his voice. A knock at the door startled him. It was his clerk, young, anxious, his tie slightly askew. Justice Thomas, he said carefully. You may want to look outside. He did. From his window high above First Street NE, he saw a gathering. Not massive, but loud. Chant signs, faces. Some carried posters with his photo crossed out in red ink. Others held up tablets playing video clips. One caught his eye. It was Traoré again shouting, "You cannot preach liberty while silencing those who never had the chance to speak." Thomas drew the blinds shut. Behind him, the photograph of his confirmation remained on the wall, crooked now, as if the frame had quietly tilted under the weight of history. He sat back in his chair. There were 3 more rulings to draft before recess. But for the first time in decades, his pen felt heavier than the gavel. Outside, the chants grew louder. Inside, a single thought formed, like a crack across a glass. Am I the last of something? Or the first to fall? In a dimly lit office at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, the ceiling fan creaked with every rotation, slicing through the stifling Sahel heat. A quiet hum filled the room, the kind of hush reserved for deep thought or long memories. President Ibrahim Traoré stood barefoot on the cool marble floor, staring at a dusty map of Africa pinned to the wall. His uniform shirt hung open, sleeves rolled. Sweat glistened on his brow, but his eyes, sharp, calculated, unflinching, were fixed on a red marker tracing colonial borders. So much had changed, and yet so little had been reclaimed. He lifted his hand slowly and circled a cluster of nations. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, the heart of resistance. He whispered to himself the words not spoken in bravado but in burden. He hadn't planned to become president. Not at 34, not through a coup, not in a land that had already buried too many dreams beneath the boots of soldiers and the ambitions of foreigners. But history didn't ask for permission. It demanded courage or silence. He had chosen courage. The flashback hit him like a scent on the wind, sudden, vivid, alive. The night he turned his weapon on his commanding officer, not in hatred, but necessity. The regime had lost all legitimacy. Corruption oozed from every ministry. The president had disappeared for weeks, rumored to be in Dubai, sipping cognac while children died in the north. Terrorists ran entire provinces. French troops occupied bases under the guise of security, while gold shipments quietly vanished into foreign hands. The people whispered of revolt, but no one dared. Until Traoré did. He remembered the moment clearly, standing atop a makeshift platform in the capital square, his uniform still stained from the night before, his voice thundering into a megaphone. The old guard has fallen. Burkina Faso belongs to its people once again. Some cheered, some cried. Many feared another cycle of strong men and broken promises. But Traoré was not molded by luxury or diplomacy. He was born in a mud brick village where electricity was a myth and textbooks were sacred. His mother, a school teacher, walked barefoot 4 miles each day just to light a single kerosene lamp for her students. She taught him something no bullet could kill. Power means nothing if it cannot protect the weak. He lived by those words. And yet, as the months passed, he realized that true power, the kind that builds roads, fuels hospitals, arms, the army feeds the starving, did not sit within African borders. It lived in Parisian boardrooms, in Brussels contracts, in Washington think tanks, especially Washington. For decades, he had watched as the U.S. hailed democracy while courting despots, praised liberty while funding covert wars. They spoke of human rights, yet remained silent as French mercenaries bombed villages suspected of militant activity. He studied their methods like a general studies enemy formations. Sanctions disguised as diplomacy, aid tethered to corporate interests, visas handed out like weapons granting legitimacy to allies, stripping it from threats. Africa had never been a partner in the Western order. It had been a resource. And yet when Traoré took the podium at the African Union Summit and declared, "The age of dictated sovereignty is over," the reaction from Washington had been swift. Officials questioned his rise, warned of anti-democratic behavior, and hinted at funding cuts. But the people, his people, had flooded the streets in support. Not because they craved a messiah, but because for the first time in years, someone spoke their pain into power. He returned to the present, stepping away from the map. His aide entered quietly, holding a tablet. The UN summit speech, "It's everywhere, sir," trending in 5 continents. Traoré didn't smile. "I wasn't trying to trend," he said. "I was trying to remind the world that Africa still has a voice." The aide hesitated. Justice Thomas responded in his latest remarks. He said legitimacy cannot be claimed through force. Traoré turned slowly, his face unreadable. "Legitimacy," he repeated. "He speaks of legitimacy while sitting on a throne carved by centuries of exclusion. Let him speak. The more he talks, the more the world will see." He walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard, where school children were practicing their national anthem beneath the sun. He placed his hand gently on the glass. "History isn't written by the victors," he said softly. "It's rewritten by those brave enough to confront them." And somewhere in the back of his mind, a question echoed, quiet but relentless. Can one voice from the heart of Africa make the mighty tremble? The United Nations Summit on Global Sovereignty and Post-Colonial Justice was meant to be routine, at least by the standards of those who designed it. A symbolic gathering. Speeches rich in moral language but light in consequence. Attendees from across the global south would be present, But the real decisions, as always, would be made elsewhere. Until Ibrahim Traoré accepted his invitation. That single RSVP shifted the tone of the entire event. Organizers scrambled, security details doubled, and in Washington, something unusual stirred an unease, not born from fear, but from the uncomfortable feeling that someone they had long dismissed had suddenly earned the microphone. Within a conference room deep inside the State Department, a half-dozen policy advisors sat around a polished table, littered with classified briefings. On one screen, Traoré's speech to the African Union played in full volume, each word landing like a drumbeat. No teleprompter, no hesitation. Every loan they offer us, he had declared, is a leash. Every promise of aid comes wrapped in conditions they never apply to their allies. We are not asking for charity, we are demanding sovereignty. There was silence when the video ended. Then a voice. We have a problem. The Undersecretary of African Affairs, a veteran diplomat with 3 decades of experience in foreign influence management, leaned forward. He's gaining traction. Young Africans worship him. Western audiences are beginning to listen. And worse, he knows exactly how to frame us as hypocrites in tailored suits. One advisor muttered, "We shouldn't have let him anywhere near that stage." But it was already too late. The real question wasn't whether Traoré would speak, it was who, if anyone, would answer him. That's when an unexpected name surfaced. Clarence Thomas. He wasn't a diplomat. He had never spoken at the UN. But the idea caught on quickly. A senior figure, black, American, conservative. His presence would lend moral weight, offer the image of balanced justice. It would remind the world that not every voice from the black diaspora spoke in one tone. The proposal reached the White House by midweek. The president remained non-committal, but Thomas's office gave a surprising response. He agreed. Some thought it was vanity, others conviction. No one truly knew why, only that this was deeply uncharacteristic. Justice Thomas had always kept his public appearances tightly controlled, his commentary rare and measured. Now he was preparing to enter one of the most symbolically charged arenas in the world, opposite a man half his age, whose very existence challenged the legacy Thomas had built. Word of Thomas's participation leaked 2 days later. Headlines ignited. Clarence Thomas to respond to Traoré at UN Summit, a global showdown. Washington's justice versus Africa's revolutionary. In Ouagadougou, Traoré's advisors met the news with quiet tension. He simply nodded. "Let them speak," he said. "I will not debate legitimacy with men who've spent their lives denying it to others." In Washington, behind his heavy oak desk, Clarence Thomas reviewed his notes by lamplight. He had written only one sentence so far. Legitimacy is not born from rebellion, it is earned through order. He underlined the final word 3 times. Outside storm clouds gathered above both capitals. The world had stopped pretending it was balanced. The game was shifting, and 2 men so different yet bound by a shared history of race, power, and exile were about to face each other on a global stage neither of them fully trusted. The United Nations General Assembly chamber was colder than usual, not in temperature but in tone. Beneath the brilliant halo of circular lights that hovered above like judgmental eyes, the room was filled with diplomatic stillness, a rehearsed silence cloaked in protocol. Flags from every nation fluttered softly in the recycled air, but the energy in the room did not stir with them. When Ibrahim Traoré entered, heads turned not in greeting, but in curiosity. Skepticism lingered behind half-hearted nods and polite glances. He wore no tie, no polished suit. Just his olive-green military jacket collar pressed sharp, the insignia of Burkina Faso embroidered with thread and pride. He walked with the stillness of someone used to carrying weight, real weight, not symbolic. His eyes scanned the room as he made his way to the African Union delegation row. There were nods from Mali, Niger, and a raised fist from a youth ambassador from the Congo. But from the rest, especially from the Western delegations, there was only guarded indifference. Then the murmurs began. A low ripple moved like wind through a wheat field. Delegates leaned toward one another, whispering, not even pretending to be discreet. One of the translators turned slightly in her booth as if to confirm the view herself. Ibrahim paused just before sitting. His gaze followed theirs. And there he was. Justice Clarence Thomas, seated not at a judge's bench, but at a desk behind the U.S. delegation's nameplate. Dressed in a dark gray suit, his face unreadable, flanked by career diplomats and national security aides, he looked like a man misplaced in the moment, but entirely in control of his presence. Traoré's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected resistance, maybe even diplomatic posturing. But this "it" was theater, a performance meant to signal something greater. You may speak, but we choose who listens. A chime echoed through the chamber. The chairperson called the summit to order. After the initial speakers and procedural platitudes, the floor was granted to the U.S. delegation. Clarence Thomas leaned forward. The microphone crackled softly. He did not clear his throat or offer a smile. His voice when it came was deliberate and practiced like a surgeon's scalpel. The question of sovereignty, he began, is not one to be taken lightly, nor can it be claimed through sheer force of will, or for that matter, force of arms. Eyes across the chamber flicked to Traoré. Thomas continued, "History reminds us that legitimacy is not bestowed upon those who seize it, but upon those who preserve it. Through law, through democratic will, through respect for institutions. It was a veiled attack, but sharp enough to cut." He never said Traoré's name. He didn't have to. The American Republic, Thomas said, has endured because we value order. Even when voices disagree, the mechanisms of law must remain sacred. When leaders bypass that sacred order, no matter how compelling their rhetoric, the world must pause and ask, what foundation do they truly stand on? There it was, the challenge. A dignified silence followed. The room was watching Traoré, now waiting for him to flinch, to fumble, to fall into the trap of defensiveness. But the Burkinabe leader simply leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, eyes unblinking. He knew exactly what this was. Not a debate, not a dialogue, a declaration. From one man clinging to the architecture of the old world, to another threatening to redraw its blueprints. When the U.S. delegation concluded their remarks, polite applause scattered through the hall. Not thunderous, not enthusiastic, just enough to respect protocol. The chairperson announced the next speaker. "I now call upon President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso." As he rose, cameras turned, pens poised. Thomas didn't look up. Traoré adjusted his collar and walked calmly to the podium. He cleared his throat once and smiled, not out of arrogance, but from something deeper. A kind of quiet certainty. He had heard the warnings. He had seen the skepticism. But he also knew the power of truth when spoken without fear. He placed both hands on the podium and looked directly at the rows of diplomats, then to the camera lens broadcasting live across continents. He would not defend himself. He would dismantle the illusion. And in doing so, begin the moment that would echo far beyond these walls. Ibrahim Traoré gripped the edges of the podium as if anchoring himself not just to the moment, but to every voice history had once tried to silence. He had no notes, no printed speech, no polished legalese, only truth and the weight of generations pressing against his spine like armor. He paused, letting the silence settle, letting them watch him. A soldier, not a statesman. Young, unrefined by their standards, but undeniable. "My name," he began slowly, voice deep and measured, "is Ibrahim Traoré. I come not as a guest, nor as a pupil of this global order, but as a man who represents the people most of you have forgotten exist." His words dropped like stones in still water. In the deserts of Burkina Faso, a mother walks 12 kilometers under the sun to reach a clinic with no medicine. Her children do not ask about democracy or order. They ask if they will eat tomorrow. And yet, from this room, from these polished desks, we are told what governance should look like. By those who once enslaved us. By those who drew borders with no regard for our bloodlines, who extracted our gold and left us with gravel. He turned his gaze toward the U.S. delegation, then continued steady and direct. "I heard the remarks of Justice Thomas. He spoke of legitimacy, of law, of sacred institutions. But I asked this chamber, what law was sacred when Patrice Lumumba was assassinated? What institution defended Thomas Sankara when Western powers helped bury him with bullets?" Gasps rippled quietly through the chamber. He went on undeterred. "I do not come here to seek validation. I come to remind you that your memory is selective. You speak of order while funding chaos. You condemn revolutions, then strike deals with kings who murder journalists. You speak of elections, but only celebrate them when your favored allies win." His voice rose, not shouting, but swelling with controlled intensity. "I was not elected in the tradition you recognize, but neither were the men who founded most of your nations. Was George Washington voted into command before the Revolution? Was the American Republic born out of paperwork or out of rebellion against exploitation? Several heads turned at that. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others stared riveted. He paused then and softened, not in message but in tone. I have read your books. I studied your heroes. Martin Luther King once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." But I wonder, did you stop reading after that line? Did you forget he also warned of the white moderate who prefers order over justice? He let the silence do the cutting this time. I do not wear this uniform because I love war. I wear it because for too long my people were told that peace must come through obedience. But peace without dignity is just another prison. The room had grown still. Even the translators slowed, their voices hushed. Traoré's eyes scanned the chamber, one sweep deliberate. I am not your enemy. I am your consequence. With that, he stepped back from the podium. No applause, just the low buzz of shock settling over the room like dust after a collapse. The chairperson stuttered through the introduction of the next speaker, who declined their turn. Cameras zoomed in. Delegates exchanged glances. In the press box, journalists typed furiously. But none of it could match the power of the moment just passed. By the time Traoré reached the hallway, his name was already trending. On TikTok, a 30-second clip of his Sankara Lumumba line gained 1 million views in under an hour. On Twitter, journalists from Nairobi to New York called it the speech of the decade. Hashtags exploded. Kyakush Traoré truth, Drasher's sovereignty, now you're not your student. In living rooms across America, viewers tuned in late asking, who is this man? In a Harlem cafe, a group of retired activists cried softly when whispering, he said what we couldn't. And in a quiet D.C. office, Clarence Thomas turned off the TV. His face betrayed nothing but his hands, steady for decades, trembled ever so slightly as it reached for his pen. Outside, the world was no longer watching politely. It was listening closely. By the time the sun rose over Washington the next morning, Ibrahim Traoré's speech had become more than a diplomatic statement. It was a cultural rupture. Cable news lit up in a frenzy. The major networks dissected his words with sharp-edged panels and ticker-tape dramatics. On Fox News, the Chiron read, African Strongman Lectures, America on Morality. One commentator, a former ambassador, sneered, this is exactly the kind of populist propaganda that dictators use before consolidating power. Over on MSNBC, the tone shifted. A civil rights historian called it the most searing global indictment of Western hypocrisy since Nelson Mandela addressed the UN. Clips from the speech aired on repeat, sandwiched between comparisons to Malcolm X and Kwame Nkrumah. On Twitter, progressive politicians tweeted quotes over black and white photos of Traoré, while conservatives warned of grooming a revolutionary threat. Podcasts exploded. Some hailed him as a global visionary, others painted him as a dangerous opportunist. Think pieces filled the digital void? Is Traoré the voice of a new multipolar order versus the mask of charisma? What Traoré isn't telling you. But whether in praise or condemnation, one fact remained consistent. Everyone now knew his name. In barbershops from Atlanta to Oakland, his speech played on cracked TVs. Veterans of civil rights marches watched with glassy eyes, nodding slowly. One elderly man wearing a faded "I am a man" button said softly to no one in particular. They finally said it right to their face. At the same time, something shifted around Clarence Thomas. What had been a calculated attempt to undercut Traoré's legitimacy now drew scrutiny onto his own. Clips of Thomas's remarks were replayed not because of what he said, but how he said it measured cold distant. To many, he looked like a man defending a system, not justice. Civil rights groups seized the moment. NAACP officials issued statements questioning Thomas's moral consistency. For a man who rose from Pinpoint, Georgia, one statement read, he seems to have forgotten the sound of his own people's voices. At Howard University, students staged a symbolic sit-in holding signs that read, Order without justice is tyranny, and we are not your exception. On social media, old rulings resurfaced. Decisions where Thomas voted against affirmative action, against protections for voting rights, against expanding civil liberties. His critics framed them not as jurisprudence, but betrayal. In a matter of hours, hashtags like, Nah, you're Uncle Clarence and Traoré spoke for us, trended side by side, creating a generational divide as potent as it was personal. Even within legal circles, whispers started. A constitutional law professor at Yale posted an op-ed titled, "When Icons Crack, Clarence Thomas in the Dissonance of Legacy." It was polite, scholarly, but cutting. Inside the Supreme Court, the marble walls still held, but the aura of invincibility around Thomas had begun to fray. Not from scandal, not yet, but from relevance. From the creeping sense that his voice, once seen as timeless, now sounded like an echo from a world slipping away. And while the U.S. media warred over narratives in Ouagadougou, Traoré sat quietly with his press secretary, watching a compilation of coverage. At the end, he looked away from the screen, contemplative. "I didn't speak to be admired," he said softly. "I spoke because silence has cost us too much." The aide asked, "Do you want to issue a follow-up?" Traoré shook his head. "No," he said. "Let them talk. The fire has already started." Long after the UN summit faded from the headlines and the pundits moved on to the next outrage, Clarence Thomas sat alone in his study, backlit by the amber glow of a brass floor lamp. The news was still running on mute. The image of Traoré, frozen mid-sentence on the screen, stared at him like a ghost that refused to leave. He sipped his lukewarm coffee and closed his eyes. And suddenly he was back there. Pinpoint, Georgia. Marshland country. Dirt roads and rusted mailboxes. The faint scent of salt water mixed with wood smoke. He remembered the thud of his bare feet on the wooden floor of his grandfather's house, the soft creak of the screen door, and the scratchy voice of Daddy, his grandfather, preaching hard work and discipline like gospel. "We don't take handouts. We earn everything." Twice. His father had vanished before Clarence could remember him. His mother worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on. But Daddy kept the boy fed, clothed, and angry at the world that expected him to be nothing. That anger became fuel. It got him through Catholic seminary, through the jeers and double glances at Holy Cross, and eventually into the lecture halls of Yale Law, where the air reeked of privilege and quiet pity. He remembered the day he got his degree. It should have been the happiest moment of his life. But as he stood in the rain clutching that parchment, all he could think about was the unspoken message he felt from every corner of the room. "You're only here because of your skin." That bitterness hardened into ideology. By the time Ronald Reagan's aides came calling in the early 80s, Thomas had already begun his quiet revolt, not against America, but against what he saw as the false promises made to his people. Civil rights leaders, in his view, had traded dignity for dependency. He believed they had chained Black identity to grievance instead of grit. Reagan's philosophy of self-reliance, of minimalist government and moral clarity, it spoke to something deep within him. He accepted the invitation to join the administration. Many of his old friends didn't understand. Some stopped returning his calls. Others called him a sellout. "You think white folks are going to save you?" One of them had shouted once, red-eyed, in a Harlem diner. "You really think they care about you in those chambers?" Thomas had said nothing, but he remembered feeling something then. Not guilt. Something colder. Something he had trained himself to ignore, the sense that they were right, but he couldn't afford for them to be. As the years passed, he became a champion for conservative constitutionalism. He saw the Constitution not as a living document to be shaped by social will, but as an anchor, a truth immune to trends. He believed in interpretation, not invention. Structure, not sentiment. To him, the law had to be above emotion, especially his own. And yet, in the quiet moments, he sometimes questioned where that stoicism had taken him. He had ruled against affirmative action because he believed it degraded Black excellence by suggesting it needed scaffolding. He struck down voting protections because he saw federal oversight as infantilizing. He dismantled race-conscious remedies because he believed in a colorblind court, even when the country was anything but. He told himself it was principle, that he wasn't here to be popular, but to be correct. But now, as Traoré's words echoed through the digital halls of history, Thomas felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. Doubt. This man from Burkina Faso, half his age, with none of the Ivy League polish, had stood on the world stage and spoken with a clarity Thomas hadn't heard since. Since Martin, since Malcolm, since before all the strategy and compromise. Thomas told himself Traoré was reckless, that he didn't understand systems, that rhetoric could never replace rule of law. But something about the fire in that young man's voice, unshackled, undiplomatic, utterly unafraid, burned through his defenses. He looked again at the screen, now black, the echo of the news broadcast lingering in the back of his mind. He reached for a pen but didn't write. Instead, he whispered, not to anyone in particular. They think I betrayed them. But what if I just forgot why I started? And with that, Clarence Thomas leaned back in his chair as the walls of his carefully built ideology stood firm around him, yet no longer felt quite as solid. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou, casting a golden shimmer across the crumbling facades of government buildings, still bearing the scars of old regimes. Ibrahim Traoré stood alone on the rooftop of the presidential compound, arms resting on the rusted guardrail, eyes fixed on the horizon where dust and sky merged into one burnt orange haze. Down below, the city pulsed with the kind of restless hope that often follows rebellion, quiet, unspoken, but real. Inside the halls behind him, his cabinet debated fuel subsidies. Generals pressed for new equipment. Aid workers begged for funds. He had given them the evening. He needed space, not to lead, not to fight, but to remember. Because for all the noise the world made about his speech, the headlines, the hashtags, the hero worship, he felt something else clawing inside him. Not pride, not even fatigue, but something colder, something harder to name: doubt. His war was not just against colonial residue or Western hypocrisy. It was within his own borders, his own people, his own heart. The ghosts of betrayal in Burkina Faso weren't French or American. They were homegrown. Men he had once called brothers had sold intel to foreign diplomats. Ministers he had promoted had hidden bank accounts in Dubai. Every time he thought the movement was gaining purity, it was dragged back into the same murky swamp that had swallowed those before him. He had begun to wonder if revolution was ever clean or just a more poetic form of decay. He stepped away from the railing and walked back into his study. The room was dim, the only light coming from a single desk lamp illuminating a printed dossier. At the top of the folder, Clarence Thomas, judicial profile. He sat down, flipping through the pages slowly. Not as a critic, but as a man searching for something buried in another man's silence. Thomas's story read like a contradiction. Black Southern roots, Catholic seminary, Yale Law, Reagan's America. But it was the early years that caught Traoré's breath. Poverty, absence, a grandfather's iron discipline, the will to rise through systems not built for you. He traced the paragraph with his finger and thought, this man too has known hunger. There was no joy in discovering the fractures in Thomas's past, only recognition, the realization that pain doesn't always produce solidarity. Sometimes it produces armor, and sometimes that armor hardens so thick even truth can't get through. He turned the page and paused at a quote from Thomas's confirmation hearing in 1991. I do not believe in quotas. I believe in merit, in structure, in law. Traoré leaned back in his chair. So much conviction, so much isolation. He closed the folder gently and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere between the rafters and the shadows, he saw the silhouette of a man not unlike himself, except Thomas had built walls to keep the world out, while he had torn his down brick by brick. He did not hate Clarence Thomas. He pitied him, not because he disagreed with him, but because he saw what Thomas might have been had he not buried his fire under robes of silence and codes of law. That kind of forgetting where you came from, was the slowest death of all. A knock came at the door. It was Miriam, his communications advisor. She hesitated before speaking. Sir, the BBC is requesting an exclusive. They want your response to Thomas's remarks. Traoré waved it off gently. Not tonight. Do you want me to prepare a statement? He shook his head. No, let the silence speak. She lingered. You okay? He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, I thought fighting the colonizers would be the hardest part. Turns out, it's fighting the colonized within us. She left without another word, closing the door behind her. He remained still, the desert wind rattling the window softly. He wasn't just fighting the West. He was fighting an inheritance of disillusionment, of stolen futures and borrowed flags, of men like Clarence Thomas who rose from the same dirt only to mistake comfort for clarity. And as the lights of the city blinked beneath him, Ibrahim Traoré whispered into the dark, "May I never forget." In a community center off Edgewood Avenue in Atlanta, a circle of folding chairs had become a battleground of generations. The room buzzed with tension, not hostility, but the kind of heat born from love and disagreement. On one end, elders from the local NAACP chapter sat upright, their voices deepened by decades of struggle. On the other, college students from Spelman and Morehouse leaned forward, passion in their eyes, some fists already clenched before the debates began. Projected on the wall behind them, muted but unmistakable, was the viral video of Ibrahim Traoré at the UN frozen mid-sentence, a hand raised as if frozen in protest. This brother right here, said Jamal, a 21-year-old political science major with a hoodie that read, unapologetically black. He said what our leaders won't say on a global stage. He dragged every Western lie into the light. An older man named Charles, retired civil rights lawyer, exhaled deeply. He spoke truth, sure, but that doesn't mean we burn down every bridge we've built just to clap for someone in fatigues. Clarence Thomas isn't a bridge, Jamal shot back. He's a wall built by the system to keep us quiet. A soft voice chimed in from the back. Aisha, a second-generation Nigerian-American, her tone calm but steady. Maybe he's not the enemy. Maybe he's a man who chose survival over solidarity. The room fell into thoughtful silence for a moment. From the corner, an elder woman in her 60s, Sister Denise, nodded slowly. That's the hardest part, baby, knowing when someone got lost and when they stopped looking to be found. Similar scenes unfolded across the country. In Chicago, protesters held signs quoting Traoré's speech, "Peace without dignity is just another prison." Outside City Hall, high school students chanted, not just for justice at home, but for global accountability. Inside their slogans were echoes of Sankara, of Baldwin, of King, but now repurposed for a new connected age. At Howard University, the campus buzzed with conversations that slipped between lecture halls and dorm lounges. Philosophy students debated natural law and revolutionary theory. Journalism majors studied Traoré's rhetorical cadence like scripture. The quad became a living symposium, one placard, reading simply from Ouagadougou to Washington. The struggle is won, and yet even among those who hailed Traoré, questions lingered. Could he lead without becoming what he condemned? Would the West listen or retaliate? And most piercing of all, what did it say about America's own justice system when a leader half a world away spoke more clearly to its youth than one of its own Supreme Court justices? The generational lines had been drawn not in hatred, but in heartbreak, between those who built freedom inch by inch and those now demanding it in strides, between memory and momentum. And somewhere in the middle, Clarence Thomas's legacy stood no longer a statue, but a question. The facade of the Supreme Court stood unmoved, gleaming in pale stone, untouched by the voices rising from its steps. But inside Washington's Beltway, the walls were beginning to shake quietly, bureaucratically, devastatingly. At first, it was just noise. A few editorials, some student protests, think pieces by newly minted academics on the intersection of African liberation and American conservatism. But the noise grew louder, rhythmic, organized. It came in the form of sharp-tongued op-eds in The Atlantic and the New York Times headlines that no longer tiptoed, "Clarence Thomas and the Death of Moral Authority, has the court forgotten who it serves?" Then came the petitions. Law students from Yale, Harvard, Howard, and Georgetown signed open letters, first hundreds, then thousands. They didn't just question his rulings. They questioned his relevance, his place in this new era of global reckoning. The language was respectful but firm. "Justice Thomas, you have become a symbol of disconnection." More troubling still were the murmurs within the judiciary itself. Judge Leona Graves, a rising star on the Ninth Circuit, gave a rare interview on a podcast aimed at young legal minds. When asked about the current state of the Supreme Court, she hesitated, then spoke with unnerving precision. "We respect the bench, but not all who sit on it have remained connected to the justice they once sought. A robe does not make one infallible." Everyone knew who she meant. And then, as if summoned from the vaults of uncomfortable memory, the past came knocking. An old interview resurfaced, grainy clip from 1991. Anita Hill composed resolute speaking about dignity and fear and consequence. The clip exploded across social media. Young audiences who had only heard her name in textbooks now saw her pain in real time. Hashtags bloom like weeds. She tried to warn us, rush, Anita was first. Trust your Uncle Clarence returns. News networks looped the footage side by side with Traoré's speech, drawing painful lines between what Thomas had once been accused of and what he now symbolized. Commentators remarked on the irony that justice who claimed to honor order was being undone by it. To compound the storm, a former legal intern, anonymous but detailed, submitted a statement to a progressive watchdog group. It alleged a pattern of condescension, intimidation, and deliberate exclusion during their time clerking under Thomas. It wasn't criminal, but it was corrosive. And in an era already attuned to power's abuses, it was enough. Through all of it, Thomas said nothing. No statements, no interviews, not even a strategic leak to friendly media. Just the same black robe, the same stern expression, the same insistence on separation between himself and the world outside the court. But inside his chambers, things had changed. The portrait of Thurgood Marshall no longer hung on the wall. He had removed it quietly without fanfare a week after Traoré's speech. His clerks noticed. No one asked. At night, he sat longer at his desk, staring not at case law, but at nothing at all. The silence that once calmed him now carried a bite. He read the letters that came in hundreds per day. Some called him a traitor. Others begged him to retire. A few still praised him, quoted his dissenting opinions as scripture. But their words felt distant, now relics from a time that no longer fit. He watched as the court's approval ratings dipped to historic lows. Protesters gathered not just at the steps of the court, but at book festivals, university lectures, state capitals. His name was now chanted, not in reverence, but in warning. One evening, he stood at the window of his private office and looked down at the Capitol dome. The same dome he once saw as a symbol of promise of arrival. Tonight, it looked hollow, fragile, like a monument to a faith long abandoned. He didn't tremble, but he didn't feel steady either. For the first time in his long career, Clarence Thomas sensed something foreign creeping into his legacy. Not scandal, irrelevance. The quiet kind that doesn't come with a fall, but a slow fade of truth spoken more clearly by a man from the Sahel than by the gavel he'd held for 3 decades. The line outside the Brooklyn Community Auditorium stretched around the block, weaving between street vendors, selling books, vintage protest buttons, and homemade posters. Inside, every seat was filled 30 minutes before the start. Students from NYU, Columbia, Howard, and even community colleges upstate had packed the hall. Professors leaned against walls. Organizers sat on the floor. Even a few off-duty staffers from the United Nations slipped quietly into the crowd. Ibrahim Traoré had arrived in America. Officially, it was a multiversity dialogue on sovereignty and decolonization. Unofficially, it was the most anticipated town hall event in New York in over a decade. The stage setup was simple, a single podium, no flag, just a black curtain behind him, and a quote from Audre Lorde projected above in soft white light. "Your silence will not protect you." When Traoré stepped onto the stage, dressed not in military fatigues, but in a loose-fitting linen tunic patterned with traditional West African motifs, the room erupted. He raised a hand not to quiet the applause, but to acknowledge its power. Not for him, but for what it meant. They were ready to listen. He didn't open with greetings or scripted lines. He didn't thank the universities. He didn't bow to American formality. Instead, he began with a story. "When I was 10, he said, I watched my uncle, barefoot and sick with malaria, walk to the village square to vote. He believed foolishly or not that it would change something. Weeks later, the results were burned before our eyes and the candidate disappeared. My uncle never voted again. Not because he stopped believing in democracy, but because he realized democracy without sovereignty is theater." The room fell silent. He continued, voice low, commanding. "In Africa, we are told to build nations with borrowed blueprints, your courts, your constitutions, your economic models. But when we demand control of our own resources, we're called unstable. When we reject foreign military bases, we're called extremists. And when we rise up, we're called illegitimate." He paused, letting the words settle. "Let me ask you this. What is legitimacy in a world where justice is for sale?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Phones were already recording. Professors exchanged glances. Traoré leaned forward, his voice rising like wind-gathering force. "The chains of colonialism," he declared, "now wear judicial robes. They speak English, quote law, and sit in buildings with marble pillars. But their purpose remains the same: to protect power, not people. Thunderous applause exploded across the room. He didn't stop. They tell us to be patient, to work within systems designed without us. But I say, if the foundation was built on our silence, then our voices are the hammer that will remake it. Some students stood. A chant began to build in the back: not your puppet, not your pawn. Traoré smiled briefly, quietly. He hadn't come to perform. He had come to speak truth buried too long beneath diplomacy and decorum. He closed the speech without flourish. Revolution is not a moment. It is a remembering. And tonight I remember who we are: not victims, not experiments, but architects. The crowd stood, many in tears, fists in the air, some stunned into reverent silence. Later that night, social media exploded again. Clips of his, quote, "The chains of colonialism now wear judicial robes" were set to music, stitched into spoken word montages, painted into murals in Brooklyn and Oakland by morning. It was no longer just a speech. It was scripture. Across the country, even among the skeptics, there was an undeniable shift. A foreign leader had come to America not to seek approval, but to hold a mirror. And for the first time in a long time, the reflection made people uncomfortable in a way they couldn't dismiss. Within hours of Traoré's town hall speech, the storm broke. Right-wing media outlets moved with mechanical precision. The headlines were immediate, relentless, and unmistakably coordinated. African Marxist declares war on American institutions. Traoré, globalist puppet or aspiring tyrant. Town hall terror. Why is a foreign dictator being given a platform on U.S. soil? Cable hosts spoke in urgent tones, their faces painted with manufactured outrage. One prominent conservative anchor warned, "This is the soft invasion, ideological, not military," and universities are letting it happen. Others drew crude comparisons between Traoré and historical strongmen, plastering his image beside Gaddafi or Mugabe, ignoring all nuance in favor of fear. They clipped the quote, "The chains of colonialism now wear judicial robes," and spun it as an open attack on the American legal system. "He insulted our Supreme Court," they cried, and no one pushed back. Panelists nodded solemnly, outraged that a foreigner would dare stand on a U.S. stage and speak without restraint. But the outrage didn't hold the airwaves for long, because something unexpected happened. The clip of Clarence Thomas's 2007 speech, one where he minimized the role of systemic racism in America, resurfaced on TikTok, reposted by a college sophomore from Detroit. Then another clip from 1995 where Thomas voted against protections in employment discrimination cases. Then his dissent in the Shelby versus Holder case, where he helped gut the Voting Rights Act. None of these were edited, no commentary needed, just the facts, cold and stark. And people watched. Young people, veterans, teachers, clergy. They watched not with rage, but with a tightening in their chest. Not because Traoré had attacked American justice, but because he had pointed to a truth they had begun to suspect but never said aloud, that perhaps justice in America had long ago become a costume stitched together by power and precedent. In small churches in Mississippi and Baltimore, sermons quietly shifted. Ministers quoted Isaiah, then Traoré, "Let justice roll down like waters, and sovereignty like a mighty stream." In veterans' halls from Detroit to Dallas, old black soldiers who had fought overseas questioned aloud why a man from Burkina Faso could speak more clearly about their pain than a judge from Georgia. In coffee shops and classrooms, the debates turned. Not is Traoré legitimate, but why does he resonate more than our own? One student posted a side-by-side image, Traoré speaking passionately before a crowd, Thomas seated in silence behind marble walls. The caption, "One speaks for us, the other judges us." A new wave of discourse flooded the digital space. Not radical, not unhinged, just deeply uncomfortably reflective. On one end, the establishment tried to pull the narrative back, issuing statements, publishing defenses of the court's integrity. But each attempt felt increasingly disconnected, written in a language that no longer moved hearts. And on the other end stood the quiet momentum of something deeper. Not admiration for a foreign leader, but a reckoning with what his words had exposed. Because when Traoré had said, "Let me ask you this, what is legitimacy in a world where justice is for sale?" he hadn't accused, he had revealed. And as that revelation echoed across screens in sanctuaries, campuses, and kitchens, one question took root in the collective American conscience: who truly represents justice now? The answer no longer seemed clear, and that more than any speech or protest was what made empires tremble. The whispers began where they always do in Washington, not in televised hearings or press briefings, but in quiet corners of old Georgetown homes behind etched glass and poured bourbon. On a Tuesday evening, 3 senators, 2 retired justices, and a former solicitor general gathered in the back room of a private club that didn't need a sign. They arrived separately, said little, and sat in the same chairs they had occupied for decades of political realignments and judicial confirmations. There was no agenda, only a shared discomfort. Clarence Thomas had become a liability. It wasn't just the protests or the op-eds. It wasn't even Traoré's speech, though many of them admitted reluctantly that it had pierced something raw. No, the concern ran deeper: leverage. The illusion of impartiality that held the court above the political fray was crumbling. And with every new leak, every resurfaced ruling paired with a donation trail, the credibility of the highest bench in the land was bleeding out. A manila envelope lay at the center of the table, thick with printed documents. No one needed to ask what was inside. They already knew. Private flight records, undisclosed meetings, friendships with donors that had conveniently aligned with key rulings. Nothing explosive, nothing criminal yet, but enough to write the first chapter of a scandal if it ever reached the wrong desk. One senator, a moderate with 30 years of strategic silence behind him, broke first. "We can't weather another storm, not with confidence this low." A former justice nodded slowly. If it were anyone else, this would already be handled. They meant it, and they didn't. Because Clarence Thomas wasn't just anyone. He was the longest-serving justice, a symbol of conservative resolve, and perhaps most dangerously now, a man who had become insulated from the political machine that once protected him. That insulation had frayed. Across the street, inside the offices of 2 separate think tanks, younger staffers were already circulating internal memos titled "Post-Thomas Landscape." The language was coded but clear. The possibility of early retirement was no longer fringe, it was strategy. Meanwhile, leaks trickled into progressive media outlets, carefully timed, quietly sourced. A late-night article published by The Intercept exposed a pattern of rulings that directly benefited a web of corporations with deep ties to one donor. Another piece connected a luxury fishing trip in Alaska to a vote on environmental deregulation. The stories weren't viral yet, but they were building, and they all echoed one unmistakable refrain. Traoré was right. The phrase appeared again and again in comment threads and editorials, not as a rallying cry, but a grim acknowledgement. The foreign leader who had warned that justice was for sale had unknowingly placed his finger on the rot, and now it reeked. Inside the Supreme Court, Thomas felt the shift, though no one said it aloud. His clerks had grown quieter. Fewer invitations arrived. Even conservative allies on the court were cautious now, polite in tone, distant in posture. It wasn't mutiny, not yet, but it was abandonment in slow motion. He noticed a staffer had removed the usual daily digest of media clippings from his desk. He didn't ask why. Elsewhere, retired figures, once allies, now ghosts, began suggesting dignified exits in carefully worded interviews. Words like transition, honor, and legacy were floated on airwaves with the same reverence used for relics at the end of their time. And in a back room, once again, someone asked finally, "What if he won't go silence?" Then the former Solicitor General, voice calm as polished glass, offered, "Then we make it impossible for him to stay." It was not a threat. It was procedure. And as the conversation dissolved into low murmurs and old habits, the city's power brokers understood something unspoken. This wasn't just about Clarence Thomas anymore. It was about preserving the illusion that the system still policed itself. Because if it didn't, Traoré's voice would be the only one people believed. And for them, that was far more dangerous than scandal. It was surrender. It dropped on a Sunday morning quietly without fanfare. No interviews, no press conference. Just a single solemn letter published in the Washington Post under the headline, "An Open Appeal to Justice for the Sack of the Court, Step Aside." Signed by 14 retired federal judges, men and women appointed across party lines from Reagan-era conservatives to Clinton-era centrists. It bore no bitterness, only gravity. The words were carefully chosen, framed in respect but sharp where they needed to be. They did not accuse Clarence Thomas of crimes nor dishonor, but they made one thing clear. His judgment, once praised for consistency and conviction, had grown detached from the lived realities of the people the court is meant to serve. They cited his increasing alignment with corporate interests, his public silence in the face of mounting ethical concerns, and his refusal to acknowledge the cultural and generational shift that had left many questioning whether he still understood the people whose struggles once mirrored his own. Midway through the second paragraph came the sentence that made the world pause. Where Justice Thomas has grown silent, others have spoken. In particular, the recent remarks by President Ibrahim Traoré, though delivered from the outside, have struck a moral chord the court would do well to hear. He may not wear our robes, but his words have echoed across our courtrooms. That was the spark. The letter spread quickly, shared-sided pars to newsrooms and faculty lounges alike. The very mention of Traoré in a formal judicial context stunned readers. A head of state from the global south invoked not as a cautionary tale, but as a moral compass. It was unprecedented. The news cycles that followed did not shout. They lingered. MSNBC opened with a somber montage. Images of Thomas in his early days, his confirmation hearing, his decades of service. Then the anchor read the full letter aloud as if it were eulogy. Meanwhile, on the south side of Chicago, in a modest apartment filled with old campaign buttons and faded newspaper clippings from the civil rights movement, 86-year-old Ruthie Bell sat in her recliner, tears in her eyes. She had marched in Selma, been arrested in Jackson, knocked doors for Shirley Chisholm, and once in 1991 she had watched Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearings with trembling hope until Anita Hill took the stand. After that, the hope dimmed, but it never fully died. Now, as her granddaughter read aloud the judge's letter from her iPad, Ruthie wept not in anger, but release. "He forgot us," she whispered, wiping her cheek. "He forgot where he came from." Her granddaughter placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Traoré didn't," she replied softly. Ruthie nodded. "That's what scares them." At the Supreme Court, the reaction was immediate, but quiet. The clerk assigned to Thomas placed the newspaper clipping on his desk folded. A yellow sticky note read, "Thought you'd want to see this." He read it 3 times. Folded it again. Didn't speak. Later that evening, he walked the halls of the court alone, past busts of justices long dead, their faces frozen in idealism or arrogance. He stopped in front of Thurgood Marshall's bronze likeness, the man he had replaced, the man he had often distanced himself from in philosophy, but could never quite outrun in history. He didn't bow, but he lingered. Outside, as dust settled over the city, people gathered with candles on the court steps. Some prayed, some chanted, a few simply sat. They didn't demand resignation, they waited for it. And for the first time, the idea didn't seem impossible. Because when the stewards of justice themselves had whispered that it was time the nation no longer heard a rebellion, it heard reason. The courtyard of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou shimmered with late-morning heat. Sunlight glinted off the microphones lined across the podium as journalists from every major continent jostled for position, sweat on their brows, anticipation in their eyes. The flag of Burkina Faso fluttered gently behind them, anchored by soldiers standing at silent attention. It was Ibrahim Traoré's first formal press conference since the cascade of global reaction. Invitations had been limited. No Western media outlet received priority. His communications team insisted equal access for all, regardless of geography or influence. He walked onto the platform with measured calm, dressed simply in a white cotton tunic. No nationalistic flourish, no polished rhetoric, just presence. When he began to speak, the crowd quieted like a switch had been flipped. I've been asked many times in the past weeks what I feel about the attention about being quoted by foreign courts about trending hashtags and television debates. He paused. Not for effect, but for clarity. This is not about me. Cameras clicked. Pens froze mid-sentence. It's about reclaiming dignity, he continued, voice steady, for all people abandoned by power. For those who were told their history was irrelevant, their pain exaggerated, their resistance inconvenient. He scanned the crowd, his gaze unwavering. I was not born to speak in marble halls or address powerful institutions. I was born in a village where water had to be fetched before dawn, where school books were shared among 5 children, and where we learned early that power listens only when it is forced to. He leaned slightly toward the microphones. Now they are listening. He lifted a single page, his only notes, and let it fall gently to the podium. The page floated down like a leaf, symbolic, silent. I did not seek to humiliate anyone. I did not come to wage war on institutions, but I will not apologize for truth. And if that truth makes the powerful tremble, perhaps they've been standing too high for too long. A long silence followed, weighted, not awkward. Then came the final blow. Dignity does not require approval. It requires memory. And we remember everything they told us to forget. He stepped away from the microphones. No questions, no declarations. Just the quiet confidence of a man who had no interest in spectacle, only in substance. By the time the press feed hit global airwaves, Twitter had erupted. Within hours, Traoré's speech was trending at #1 in the United States, France, South Africa, Brazil, and the UK. Snippets of his words were translated into over a dozen languages by independent activists. One popular meme showed the fallen paper in slow motion, set to Nina Simone's "I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free." In Paris, young activists marched with signs that read, "Nous nous souvenons," we remember. In Johannesburg, students projected the speech onto the side of a university building. In New York, the quote, "Dignity does not require approval," was graffitied across the side of a courthouse wall. And in the global South, in cities long ignored, a movement, not of protest but of posture, began. Not defiance, not celebration. Something older, something deeper. Reclamation. The hearing was closed to the public. No cameras, no transcripts. Just a single wooden table in a high-security Capitol chamber where Clarence Thomas sat surrounded by stone-faced senators and legal aides, his hands folded, his face unreadable. It was not a trial, not officially, but everyone knew what it was. He had been summoned quietly through back channels under the guise of an ethics review consultation. That was the language chosen to protect the institution, to shield the court from scandal. But the real reason was far more urgent. Too many questions, too many dots connected, and now too many leaks to ignore. The senators kept their voices, even their questions, precise. Most came with documentation, receipts, emails, appointment logs, board affiliations. The questioning was not hostile, but it was surgical. Justice Thomas answered slowly and carefully, but then almost imperceptibly he slipped. A name, a trip, a connection he could no longer plausibly deny. One senator leaned forward, pen clicking softly. "So just to clarify, you were aware that your friend's investment firm stood to benefit from the ruling?" Thomas didn't respond immediately. His lips pressed together, not in defiance but fatigue. "I was aware, generally," he said at last. Silence. That was all it took. By the following day, the leak hit the press. Not a full transcript, just enough. A well-placed sentence. A moment of confirmation. "I was aware, generally." Within hours, headlines ignited. "Justice knew of beneficiary ties in ruling, leaked notes reveal." The story spread like blood in water. Pundits pounced. Newspapers updated timelines. Late-night hosts dropped the usual jokes and spoke with eerie solemnity. And then came the polls. For the first time in modern American history, public trust in the Supreme Court fell below 30%. Conservatives blame the leak. Progressives blame the system. Independents, perhaps the most telling group, simply stopped defending the court at all. Outside the marble steps, protests resumed, but now they looked different. They weren't reactive. They were focused, organized. Signs didn't just name Clarence Thomas. They named all 9 justices. Some placards read "Lifetime appointments," "Lifetime unchecked." Others were more direct: "Judgment without consequences, tyranny." Civil society groups launched coordinated campaigns. The ACLU, the Brennan Center for Justice, and new coalitions of legal scholars released urgent reports demanding sweeping reform, mandatory term limits, financial transparency requirements, independent oversight. For decades, even the court's critics had hesitated to demand reform too loudly, but now the sacred veil was gone. There was no mystique left, just men and women in robes making decisions that shaped lives while living above the rules they interpreted. Congress held emergency hearings. Legal commentators declared the constitutional earthquake underway. A televised panel on PBS featured a former appellate judge who said bluntly, "We are no longer debating if reform is needed. We are debating what shape it will take." Inside the court, the justices said little. But the mood had shifted. Hallway conversations were shorter. Clerks exchanged nervous glances. The court's press office released an anemic statement affirming continued commitment to integrity and transparency, but no one believed it. And at the center of it all, Clarence Thomas returned to his chambers. He walked past his office bookshelf filled with constitutional tomes and biographies of men who once seemed untouchable. He sat at his desk, stared at his reflection in the darkened window, and breathed slowly, quietly, heavily. Outside, the world no longer whispered. It demanded, and the marble had begun to crack. It aired without warning, no teaser, no promotional clip, no countdown. Just a sudden interruption of the usual programming. "This is a special broadcast," the anchor said, her voice hushed, almost reverent. Justice Clarence Thomas in an exclusive unannounced interview. The footage cut to a dimly lit studio. A single chair, no desk, no dramatic lighting. Just two people facing each other. Clarence Thomas' hands folded in his lap, and renowned journalist Gloria Randall, known for her quiet precision and ability to draw truth from silence. He looked older than he had weeks ago. Not just tired, but surrendered. No robe, no lapel pin, just a charcoal gray suit and an expression stripped of pride. Randall began softly. "Justice Thomas, thank you for agreeing to speak." He gave a slow nod. "Not sure how much longer people would want to hear from me." "Why now?" she asked. He looked down, then up. "Because I have spent my whole life believing that silence was strength, but sometimes silence is just fear in a better suit." Randall didn't interrupt. "I was raised to believe in duty," Thomas continued, voice steady but worn. "To work twice as hard, to never show weakness. My grandfather told me, no one owes you anything, not even justice. I carried that like scripture. But you rose to the highest court in the country." "Yes. And I stayed there for 30 years believing that detachment made me pure. That if I stuck to the text, if I ignored the noise, I could avoid becoming political. But law isn't untouched by time, and neither are we." There was a long pause. "You've been accused of losing touch," Randall said gently, "of failing to recognize the moment." Thomas didn't flinch. "They're not wrong." The air in the studio shifted. He leaned forward slightly as if confessing not to her, but to someone long gone. "I was afraid of becoming irrelevant. I was afraid that if I admitted the world had changed, it would mean I no longer belonged in it. So I clung to rules, precedent, structure. I mistook it for principle." He exhaled deeply, eyes softening. "Then along comes this young man," he said, the hint of a smile flickering. "From Ouagadougou, dressed in linen, not law. Speaking truths I once thought were dangerous, but now I see they were necessary." Randall waited. Thomas glanced at the camera, not defiantly, not dramatically, just honestly. "Perhaps," he said, voice low and unguarded, "the boy from Ouagadougou had more clarity than I." Silence followed, the kind that doesn't demand filling. He didn't ask for redemption. He didn't name Traoré again. He didn't defend his past. He simply looked at the floor, then back at Randall. "What happens now?" she asked. "I don't know," he said, "but I know it shouldn't be about me anymore." The screen faded to black, no credits, no music. Just the faint hum of a nation holding its breath. Within minutes, the clip was shared across every platform. It trended not in anger, but in disbelief. Some called it cowardice, others grace. But one thing was certain: Clarence Thomas had, for the first time in decades, stopped speaking as a judge and started speaking as a man. And somewhere in Ouagadougou, a young president watched quietly, turned off the screen, and whispered just loud enough for those near him to hear, "Even empires can learn." The announcement came not with ceremony, but with silence. At 9:42 a.m., a short press release was posted to the official website of the Supreme Court. No fanfare, no speech. Just 12 lines of text written in the dry clinical language of institutional endings. Justice Clarence Thomas has announced his retirement from the United States Supreme Court, effective at the conclusion of the current term. His decision is based on ongoing health concerns. The court thanks Justice Thomas for his decades of dedicated service to the American legal tradition. That was it. No reflection on his impact, no mention of legacy. Just a quiet departure padded in vague reasoning and the polite erasure of what had led to it. The news spread quickly. Networks broke in. Push notifications flashed on screens across the country. Some pundits speculated it was orchestrated a graceful exit before a louder fall. Others questioned the phrasing, noting there had been no mention of illness in the months prior. But the public reaction was not explosive. It was still, like a storm that had passed, leaving nothing behind but flattened earth. In churches and campuses, law offices, and barbershops, people received the news with a nod or a sigh. Not celebration, not mourning, just acknowledgement. A chapter had closed and no one was quite sure what had been written in it. Journalists scrambled for reactions, chasing sound bites from political figures and legal scholars. Social media boiled with speculation. One network reached out directly to the office of President Ibrahim Traoré, hoping for a quote, a headline, another moment of moral clarity to punctuate the resignation. They received a short reply. President Traoré respects the internal matters of the American judiciary and declines to comment on the retirement of Justice Clarence Thomas. Let the people decide what justice looks like now. No victory lap, no condemnation, just a return of power to its rightful place, the people. In that absence of spectacle, a different kind of message resonated, one that wasn't broadcast but whispered between generations, printed on protest signs, now tucked away in closets, and carried silently in the minds of those who had long felt unheard. Justice for once had not been delivered in a ruling, but in the space left behind. That evening outside the Supreme Court, candles flickered in paper cups. A few people stood in quiet reflection. One young woman placed a folded piece of paper at the base of the steps. On it, written in careful cursive, were only 4 words: "We remember who forgot." And far away in the presidential residence in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré sat on a veranda watching the sun dip low over the land that had shaped him. No cameras, no audience, only silence and the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones never claimed. In the months following Clarence Thomas's quiet resignation, something unexpected began to bloom, not in courtrooms or parliaments, but in cafes, classrooms, and co-working spaces across the U.S., the Caribbean, and West Africa. Young African Americans, once disillusioned with traditional institutions, found a new spark. Traoré's speeches had become more than viral moments. They were blueprints. Think tanks emerged in Atlanta. Oakland, Accra, and Dakar focused on sovereignty, decolonial economics, and reimagining justice. One group called themselves the Sankara Collective. Another went by Clarity Rising, a direct nod to Traoré's most quoted phrase. They weren't chasing fame. They were building frameworks, digital platforms, grassroots organizing models, youth summits, bridging the African continent and the diaspora. Zoom calls connected teenagers in New York with students in Bamako. A new language of solidarity was forming, forged not through historical guilt, but shared aspiration. Even cultural spheres responded. Artists painted murals of Traoré beside Angela Davis and Steve Biko. Rappers name-dropped Ouagadougou in verses about freedom. A new documentary, The Boy from the Sahel, aired on Netflix, watched by millions within its first week. And most notably, in cities once ignored by policy circles, Baltimore, Lagos, Kingston, a shared idea took hold. The global South is not behind. It's awakening. What Traoré had ignited wasn't simply political, it was spiritual. And for the first time in generations, a bridge between Africa and its children abroad wasn't built by colonizers or corporate contracts. It was built by voice. The air in Ouagadougou was still the day Ibrahim Traoré returned to Sankara's resting place. He came without escort, without announcement. Just a single white flower held gently in his hand and a folded piece of paper in his pocket. The grave sat beneath the open sky, modest in stone but mighty in presence. Traoré kneeled, not in worship but in memory. He placed the flower down with care, his fingers trembling slightly. He took out the paper, a handwritten speech he'd never delivered. It contained the words he once thought he'd need to say to win the world over. He tore it in half then again and let the pieces fall. He no longer needed permission to speak truth. A soft breeze swept through the space. Traoré stood looking not at the grave but past it toward the horizon, toward what was still possible. A voice his own echoed in quiet narration. A revolution begins, not with guns but with truth. Not with anger, but with memory. Not in silence, but when someone dares to speak where others have been told to forget. And with that, he turned away not to leave the past behind, but to carry it forward. A bell rang in a quiet public school on the south side of Chicago. Inside a sixth-grade classroom, sunlight spilled through the windows, catching dust in the air like stars. At the front of the room, a teacher in a simple navy sweater held up a tablet showing a paused clip of Traoré's now famous town hall speech. Today, she said, we're going to talk about courage, about what it means to speak when no one gives you permission. She tapped the screen. The students listened intently as Traoré's voice filled the room. Dignity does not require approval. It requires memory. When the video ended, she looked out at her class. Can anyone tell me what he meant by that? Silence for a moment. Then from the third row, a boy slowly raised his hand. His hair was braided. His notebook covered in superhero stickers. His voice was quiet but sure. Does it mean we already matter even if they don't say it? The teacher smiled. Yes, she said. Exactly that. He looked down, then back up. Could I be like him? The room went still, and the teacher who once doubted her own voice walked to the board and wrote a single word. Yes. As the screen faded to black, a narrator's voice whispered the closing line. History doesn't belong to the powerful, it belongs to the courageous. Sometimes it takes just one voice to shake the walls of power. Ibrahim Traoré didn't fight with weapons, but with truth, memory, and unwavering dignity. His story reminds us that justice isn't about titles or robes. It's about the courage to speak when silence is safer. What would you stand up for even if the whole room turned against you? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.